need to be honest with you. There is a $6 bottle sitting on a shelf at your local hardware store right now that will permanently restore every scratch, every gray patch, and every worn-out spot on any gun stock you own. The hunting industry charges you $224 for the exact same compound with a camouflage label slapped on top. That is not a typo. $224 for a product whose active ingredient costs $6. Your grandfather never paid $200 to keep his deer rifle looking like it just left the factory. He walked into the hardware store, picked up a tin of raw linseed oil, and the wood did the rest. What the industry buried was not a secret formula. It was the patience to let it cure. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a master stock finisher named Roy Maddox, a man who spent 30 years restoring rifles the industry told you were beyond saving. And he never once reached for a branded bottle. We're going to break down the hard chemistry of why this works at the molecular level, uncover the military history the gun care aisle was designed to make you forget, and expose a deadly danger hidden inside every drop of this oil that no one talks about. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and let's expose the truth. Welcome to HuntForge. Let's start with the elephant in the room. The gun care industry in this country generates over $900 million a year. $900 million. And a massive slice of that revenue comes from convincing you that maintaining your rifle requires specialized, highly engineered chemistry that only their labs can produce. Walk into any sporting goods store, walk into Cabela's, walk into Bass Pro. You will see an entire aisle lined with beautifully packaged gun stock finishing products. The most famous of these is Tru-Oil from Birchwood Casey. It is a household name. Every hunter knows it. Every gun shop pushes it. But what the industry didn't want you to know is that if you actually pull up the safety data sheet for Tru-Oil, the document that companies are legally required to publish, you will find a very familiar ingredient listed right there in black and white: linseed oil. That is not a rumor from a late-night gunsmithing forum. That is documented fact on the product's own regulatory paperwork. The specialized formula simply adds metallic chemical dryers and thinners to speed up the curing process. That is it. That is the magic. Here is the kicker. A standard 4-ounce bottle of Tru-Oil costs around $35. If you do the math, that comes out to roughly $224 for a single quart of the liquid. Now, you can walk into any local hardware store right now and buy a quart of raw linseed oil, the exact same base compound, doing all of the actual restoration work, for around $6. $6 versus $224. You are paying 37 times the price for a product simply because it has a camouflage label and sits next to the deer calls in the hunting aisle. The markup only works on customers who do not know the source material, and trust me, they are counting on you not knowing. And I need to be honest about something else. I was one of those customers. 3 years ago, I had a walnut stock on a Remington 700 that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. The finish was dead. Gray patches across the wrist, deep scratches on the forend from resting it against a fence rail on a freezing November morning. I looked at that stock and did exactly what the industry trained me to do. I drove to the sporting goods store. I bought a $35 bottle of Tru-Oil. I slathered on a thick coat, like the label suggested, and waited 2 hours for it to dry. The finish looked fine for about 6 weeks. Then, right in the middle of deer season, it started peeling off in sheets. Thin, plastic-looking strips catching on my jacket every time I shouldered the rifle. So I bought another bottle. Same result. Then a third. I spent $105 that year trying to fix what a $6 bottle of raw linseed oil would have fixed permanently, if I had known what a man named Roy Maddox knew. So when I tell you the industry is selling you speed instead of permanence, I am not preaching from a pulpit. I am confessing from the pew. And that confession is what led me to Roy's workshop in rural Tennessee. Roy Maddox is a master gunstock finisher who spent 30 years doing stock restoration out of a small, dusty shop in rural Tennessee. He started back in the 1970s, and over his 3-decade career, he finished hundreds of rifle stocks for hunters, collectors, and competitive shooters across the Southeast. And guess what? He never once relied on the expensive, branded marketing hype. Every single stock he ever restored, he finished with a $6 quart of raw linseed oil. Roy apprenticed under a legendary stockmaker named Glenn Purvis, a man who had been finishing walnut rifle stocks since the 1950s, bringing over 40 years of hard-earned, calloused hand experience to the workbench. When Roy started learning the trade, Tru-Oil didn't even exist yet. What Glenn had was a simple shelf lined with tins of raw linseed oil and the deep artisanal knowledge of exactly how to use it. Glenn told Roy something that completely changes how you should view your hunting gear. He said that the hunters who came into the shop asking for the fastest possible finish were almost always the ones who came back with a stock that needed redoing in 3 years. The hunters who had patience, who trusted the wood, never came back at all. Glenn put it simply. He said, "The wood needs time with each coat. Give it 48 hours, and it gives you a decade." That is the secret, my friends. Your grandfather never needed a $35 bottle of chemicals to keep his deer rifle looking pristine. He had patience. The wood does not know what label is on the tin. It does not care whether you bought it at Cabela's or at a hardware store. It only responds to the linseed oil doing what linseed oil has done for centuries, soaking in, cross-linking, and becoming part of the grain forever. Now, let's talk about what is actually happening when you apply this oil to your rifle. This is where the industry really does not want you paying attention, because once you understand the chemistry, their entire pricing model collapses. Raw linseed oil, which is sometimes called flaxseed oil, is cold-pressed from the seeds of the flax plant. It is what chemists classify as a drying oil. But that name is misleading, because it does not dry by evaporation the way water or alcohol does. It transforms through a complex chemical reaction called autoxidation. Picture this. You rub a thin coat of oil into your rifle stock. The moment that oil hits the air, the high concentration of polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically alpha-linolenic acid, the primary cross-linking agent, begins to absorb atmospheric oxygen molecule by molecule. The double bonds in those acid chains reach out and grab oxygen atoms, forming unstable compounds called hydroperoxides. Those hydroperoxides break down into free radicals, and those radicals do something extraordinary. They attack neighboring fatty acid chains, bonding them together, chain after chain after chain, until the entire layer of oil has transformed into a rigid, three-dimensional polymer network. Think of it like this. Imagine you pour honey into a sponge. Now imagine that honey slowly, over 48 hours, hardens into flexible amber that locks every fiber of that sponge together permanently. That is what raw linseed oil does to walnut. In plain English, the liquid oil literally turns into a flexible, solid polymer matrix deep inside the cellular structure of the wood. It does not just sit on top of the stock like a cheap layer of polyurethane or varnish that can easily peel, chip, or crack when you drag your rifle through a cedar thicket on opening morning. It becomes part of the wood itself, locking the fibers together and providing a permanent barrier against moisture, impact, and time. This isn't folklore. This isn't a forum theory. The United States Forest Products Laboratory, a premier national research facility that rigorously tests wood finishes, has extensively analyzed the performance data of pure tung and linseed oils against moisture penetration. Their testing reveals exactly how these oils behave over multiple coats, proving that the chemical cross-linking of polymerized oils creates a highly resilient protective film. When you use raw linseed oil, because it cures so slowly, this protective lattice forms incredibly deep within the wood, soaking down into the grain the way creek water sinks into riverbank clay. Faster-drying commercial products, the ones with metallic dryers added, often only form this polymer network near the surface, which is exactly why my Tru-Oil finish peeled off in sheets after 6 weeks. The slowness is not a flaw. The slowness is the entire point. And that is what the industry will never print on the label. To really appreciate the power of raw linseed oil, we have to step out of the hardware store and into the armories of the United States military. Because before the modern hunting industry existed, before Brownells, before Birchwood Casey, before any of them, the U.S. military had to figure out how to protect millions of wooden rifle stocks from the absolute worst conditions on the face of the earth. During the early 20th century, the U.S. military relied on raw linseed oil as the standard, factory-issued finish for the iconic M1903 Springfield and the early production M1 Garand rifles. In the armories at Springfield and Rock Island, workers would literally dip the raw walnut stalks into massive, heated vats of linseed oil and hang them up in drying rooms for days, not hours, days. If you have ever seen an original vintage M1 Garand at a gun show or in a collector's cabinet, you know what I'm talking about. They possess a breathtaking, deep, reddish-brown color that stops you in your tracks. Collectors go crazy for this color. They pay thousands of dollars for stocks that still have the original finish. But here is the amazing part. That red hue cannot be faked with wood stain. That color is the direct chemical result of the linolenic acids in raw linseed oil oxidizing and naturally darkening over decades of exposure to ultraviolet light and the elements. It is chemistry and time working together, the same way a leather saddle left in a barn darkens into that rich chestnut brown that no dye can replicate. And here is what the industry buried. When they boil linseed oil and add metallic drying agents like cobalt or manganese to make it dry faster, they strip out the very fatty acids that create this beautiful, historical red patina. Fast-curing commercial products might save you a few hours of waiting, but they rob you of the permanent, self-healing, classic finish that protected American soldiers through world wars, through Korea, through the jungles of the Pacific. The $6 bottle gives you what the $35 dollar chemically cannot. That is not opinion. That is organic chemistry. But listen to me closely, because this next part is a matter of life and death. I am not being dramatic. The process of autoxidation that makes linseed oil so incredible for your gunstock is the exact same process that can burn your house to the ground if you do not respect it. Because the curing process is an exothermic reaction, meaning it generates its own heat as it absorbs oxygen, every coat you apply is essentially a slow, controlled fire at the molecular level. When you rub the oil into your rifle stock, that heat safely dissipates into the air of your garage or workshop. No problem. But what happens to the rag you used? The National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA, has issued strict warnings about this, and every firefighter in this country knows the danger. If you take an oil-soaked cotton rag, wad it up into a ball, and toss it onto your workbench or into a trash can, the heat generated by the curing oil becomes trapped inside the folds of the cloth. With nowhere to escape, the temperature climbs steadily, degree by degree, hour after hour, until it reaches the auto-ignition point of the cotton fabric. Without a single spark, without a match, without a flame anywhere near it, that rag will spontaneously combust and burst into a raging fire. According to the NFPA, spontaneous combustion from drying oils accounts for over 14,000 structure fires every single year in the United States. 14,000. Garages, workshops, sheds, and homes destroyed because someone wadded up a rag and walked away. So how do you stay safe? It is simple, and Roy Maddox drilled this into every person who walked into his shop. When you are done applying a coat to your rifle, you take that rag and lay it perfectly flat on a non-combustible surface outside, like a concrete driveway or a cinder block, and you leave it there until it is completely stiff, hard, and dry. Once it is fully polymerized, it is inert and safe. Or you toss it immediately into a sealed metal container filled with water to cut off the oxygen supply and stop the reaction cold. Never, ever pile oily rags together. Not in a trash can, not in a bucket, not balled up on a workbench, flat, outside, alone, or sealed in water. Those are your only two options. Respect the chemistry, and it will serve you for a lifetime. Ignore it, and you lose everything. So, how do we actually use this $6 secret to permanently restore a hunting rifle? Let's go back to Roy Maddox's workbench in Tennessee. Roy brought out a rifle that had been neglected in a barn for 12 years. The stock was a piece of American black walnut that had once been beautiful, but time and moisture had turned it into something most hunters would throw away. The finish was dead, dry, and gray, with deep fence scratches running across the wood like scars. He didn't aggressively sand it. He didn't reach for harsh chemical strippers or bleach. He didn't call it a lost cause. First, he simply wiped the wood with a dry cloth to remove loose grit and surface dust. Then he poured a tiny amount of raw linseed oil into a tin lid, the same kind your grandmother might have used to hold sewing pins, dipped a small cotton rag into it, and rubbed the oil into the wood along the grain with slow, deliberate strokes. The secret technique here is friction. By rubbing the oil into the wood with the palm of your hand, you generate localized heat. This heat lowers the oil's viscosity, which is its resistance to flow, forcing the oil deep into the microscopic pores, vessels, and cell walls of the walnut. You are not painting the surface, you are feeding the wood from the inside out. But here is where 99% of guys fail, and it is exactly where the industry wants you to fail. Because when you fail with raw oil, you go running back to their $35 bottle. You must apply a coat so whisper-thin that the wood barely looks damp. You wipe off any excess before it tacks up, because if you leave a thick layer sitting on the surface, it will turn into a sticky, gooey mess that never cures properly. The wood will only keep what it can absorb. Everything else is waste. And then you wait. You set that rifle down at room temperature, and you walk away for a full 48 hours. No fans, no heat lamps, no shortcuts, just time. This is the part where Glenn Purvis's voice echoes in Roy's head. Give it 48 hours, and it gives you a decade. Why? Because when you trap wet oil under a second coat before the first has fully polymerized, those alpha-linolenic acid chains cannot complete their cross-linking network. Neither layer cures correctly, and you end up with a soft, rubbery finish that will fail within a single hunting season, just like my Tru-Oil did on that Remington 700. Roy repeats this process with the discipline of a man who has done it 1,000 times. Thin coat, wipe off the excess, wait 48 hours. Thin coat, wipe off the excess, wait 48 hours. By the third coat, the grain definition sharpens. The walnut starts whispering its figure back to you, the swirls and chatoyance that were invisible under the dead gray surface. By the fifth coat, taking over 10 patient days, that abused, scratched-up barn rifle looked like a perfectly maintained masterpiece. The scratches were still there, adding character the way lines add character to a good man's face, but the wood itself was completely revitalized, radiating a low, flat, warm luster that no synthetic wipe-on plastic coating can ever replicate. The total cost in materials for this permanent restoration? Less than $2 worth of raw linseed oil per rifle. $2. For a finish that breathes, flexes, and can be seamlessly repaired at any point in the future simply by rubbing a few more drops of oil into a new scratch. Compare that to polyurethane, which chips and cannot be spot repaired, or Tru-Oil, which peels and requires complete strip and recoat jobs. Roy Maddox looked at that finished rifle and said something I will never forget. He said, "The wood was never damaged. It was just thirsty."
Remember that beat-up deer rifle I asked you to picture at the start of this video? The one sitting in the back of your safe right now with the gray patches and the fence rail scratches? Roy Maddox would look at that stock and see exactly what Glenn Purvis taught him to see back in 1972. Not damage. Potential. 5 thin coats. 10 patient days. Less than $2 in raw linseed oil, and a finish that will outlast every $35 bottle the industry ever puts on a shelf. The gun care industry markets relentlessly to hunters who do not understand source chemistry. They want you to believe that a fast, shiny finish is a good finish. But the truth is, speed is the enemy of permanence. The metallic dryers in commercial products save you maybe 4 hours per coat. On a job you only do once before deer season, that time saving means absolutely nothing except profit for them and a peeling finish for you. What the industry buried was never a product. It was a principle, that the wood needs time, not money. Your grandfather knew that. He sat on the porch with a rag and a tin of oil, and he gave the stock what it asked for. Glenn Purvis knew that. He passed it to Roy Maddox in a dusty Tennessee shop in the 1970s. Roy spent 30 years proving it, one 48-hour coat at a time, on hundreds of rifles that hunters had given up on. Now you know it too. And that makes you dangerous to a $900 million machine that profits only when you stay ignorant. But here's what keeps me up at night. Knowledge like this disappears when no one passes it down. Glenn passed it to Roy. Roy passed it to this video. The only question left is whether it stops here or keeps moving. Hitting subscribe on HuntForge is not a courtesy. It is not about likes. It is not about helping the algorithm. It is a decision to stand between this knowledge and the industry that wants it erased. Every time one of these videos reaches a hunter who is about to hand over $35 for a repackaged $6 compound, the machine loses. Before you close out, do one thing. Drop a comment below and tell me the rifle you are going to restore first. I want to see those stocks come back to life. Grab that $6 quart of raw linseed oil. Respect the fire hazard like Roy taught us. Lay those rags flat and get your rifle ready for opening day. Next week, we are going after something the industry is even more desperate to hide. I will see you then.